The quiet walls and louder secrets of the convent. Hey guys, tonight, we're heading somewhere a little quieter. Somewhere candlelit, echoing with soft chants and occasional gossip. So grab your blanket, dim the lights, and maybe pour yourself something comforting. Tea, wine, or whatever you think medieval monks were definitely judging people for. Because tonight, we're talking about the secret lives of medieval nuns. Women who were supposed to live in purity and silence, and often ended up living in drama and whispered scandal. Now, before we start clutching our rosaries in judgment, it's worth remembering, a medieval convent wasn't exactly a peaceful retreat for spiritual enlightenment. It was more like a combination of a boarding school, an unwanted marriage, and a social prison, all rolled into one. You didn't always choose to become a nun. Sometimes you were chosen by your parents, by your lack of dowry, or by the simple fact that your family already had too many daughters to marry off. For a lot of noble families, convents were basically storage for spare women. Got a daughter who's not particularly pretty? Send her to the convent. Got a daughter who's too spirited and keeps flirting with the stable boys? Convent. Got one who's born second or third in line with no inheritance prospects? Convent. Problem solved. And inside those walls, behind the chants and the incense, were women who were, very quietly, still human, with emotions, desires, rivalries, and in some cases, pretty elaborate romantic lives. So tonight, we're going to wander, very slowly, very calmly, through a few centuries of holy women doing unholy things. We'll meet the nuns who fell in love, who ran away, who plotted, and who occasionally ended up pregnant and confused about how that happened inside a locked cloister. But before the scandals, let's float back a bit, to what life inside a medieval convent actually looked like. The setting, cloisters, candles, and cold bread. Most convents in the Middle Ages were not the picturesque, flower-filled havens you see in modern movies. They were usually cold, damp, and surprisingly noisy. Bells ringing at all hours, the shuffle of feet in prayer, the occasional snoring of someone who fell asleep mid-psalm. The daily routine was structured, to put it gently. You'd wake before sunrise, stumble into the chapel, chant a few psalms, maybe get a piece of hard bread and a cup of thin beer for breakfast, because water was suspiciously full of plague most of the time. Then came hours of chores, gardening, laundry, spinning wool, illuminating manuscripts if you were lucky enough to be educated, and of course a lot of praying. The rule of St. Benedict, that old favorite for monastic life, made sure there wasn't a lot of fun time built into the day. Silence was a virtue, obedience was sacred, and joy was suspicious. But even in that strict, solemn rhythm, human nature has this funny habit of sneaking through the cracks. When you lock dozens of young women in the same place for life, many of whom never actually wanted to be there, something's bound to happen, and it did. The unwanted brides of Christ. Let's talk about how women ended up in these convents in the first place, because that's where a lot of the trouble starts. In noble families, it was all about money and politics. Marrying off a daughter required a dowry, a hefty one. And if you had multiple daughters, the math didn't look good. So, you'd pick one to marry a local lord, maybe another to strengthen an alliance. And the rest, well, God can have them. Parents would literally tell their daughters, "Congratulations, you're marrying Christ." Which sounds lovely until you realize the ceremony was basically identical to a wedding. Full white gown, veil, vows, except the groom was invisible and had a far stricter curfew policy. Many girls entered convents as young as 12 or 13. Some were excited for a quiet, studious life. Others, not so much. There are records of girls crying, screaming, or fainting during their spiritual wedding. One chronicler in the 1200s even described a nun's family tying her to the altar to stop her from running away mid-ceremony. And once you were in, leaving was difficult, in some cases physically impossible. Some convents had literal grills and locked gates, the same architectural setup as a prison, except everyone inside was wearing linen and praying for forgiveness. It's not hard to see how that kind of isolation could make things weird. A little too close to heaven now. Not all convents were equally strict. Some, especially those for high-born nuns, were basically luxurious estates. You had servants, fine fabrics, personal rooms, even family visits. One French abbess in the 14th century reportedly kept a pet peacock and refused to share her private bath. Others were, let's say, less holy. The Abbey of St. Marie in Winchester, for example, gained a reputation for being lively. Local bishops kept sending letters complaining that the nuns were receiving men after dark. which, if we translate from medieval Latin, means we know what you're doing. Please stop. At another convent in France, an investigation in 1307 found that several nuns were secretly meeting men from a nearby monastery, through a cleverly dug tunnel between the two cloisters. It's always the tunnels, isn't it? And sometimes, the lovers weren't monks or outsiders at all. They were priests sent to hear confessions, which in hindsight seems like an incredibly bad setup. You're a lonely nun, isolated from the world, talking to the only man you're allowed to speak to in private, about your deepest sins and temptations. He's supposed to guide your soul. Instead, you fall in love. It happened so often that church authorities had to issue repeated warnings. The 12th century bishop Peter the Venerable, who sounds like he was absolutely not having a good time, once complained that nuns were turning confession into occasions of carnal temptation. He was, unsurprisingly, ignored. Let's glide over to some real stories, all right. We've set the scene. Cold convents, unwanted vows, too many secrets. Let's float gently into some real lives. Our first story is from Italy. Around the late 1400s, a convent in Ferrara. Inside its stone walls lived a young woman named Sister Euphrasia, who had been forced into the veil by her family after a broken engagement. She wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Within a year, she'd started exchanging letters with a local nobleman, delivered secretly by a sympathetic servant. Before long, the letters turned into nightly visits through the convent garden. When the affair was discovered, the abbess tried to cover it up, but the bishop caught wind, sent inspectors, and found Euphrasia in her cell with a bundle of love poems and a rather expensive necklace that definitely didn't come from Jesus. She was publicly shamed, but her lover escaped punishment entirely, because of course he did. The irony? A century later, that same convent would become famous for its music. The convent of St. Catherine of Ferrara, known for angelic voices. Euphrasia's ghost, if you believe in that sort of thing, was said to hum along. The poet nuns of Lombardy. Not all the forbidden romances were tragic, though. Some became art. In Lombardy, Italy, during the Renaissance, there was a group of nuns known for writing intensely emotional poetry. Historians still debate whether the poems were purely spiritual, or, well, a bit more personal. Lines like, "His touch burns like divine fire through my soul," sound less like devotion and more like a diary entry written after curfew. The church wasn't thrilled, but the poems survived, and centuries later, they've become a rare window into how these women felt. Because that's the thing. Even when forbidden love didn't end well, it proved something quietly radical, that these women, trapped in religious systems they didn't choose, still managed to express desire, creativity, and rebellion in their own voices, even if they had to hide it in metaphor. Saint or sinner? Sometimes both. Then there's the case of Sister Benedetta Carlini, who deserves her own entire bedtime special. And maybe one day, we'll give her that. For now, here's the short version. Benedetta was an abbess in 17th century Italy. She claimed to have divine visions, conversations with angels, and even with Christ himself. Her fame grew. People came from miles away to witness her ecstasies. But then another nun, her close companion Bartolomea, confessed that those visions sometimes included, let's call them intimate encounters, with Benedetta playing the role of both saint and seducer. Church investigators descended. They were horrified, fascinated, and deeply confused. Benedetta was removed from power and imprisoned inside her own convent for decades. It's one of those cases where history can't decide. Was she a mystic, a manipulator, or just a woman starved of touch in a world that offered her no safe outlet for being human? Maybe all three. The quiet revolt for every scandal that made it into the records. There were dozens that didn't. But we know they happened. Because bishops kept writing letters begging nuns to behave. And because convent rules got stricter with every century. No visitors. No correspondence. No talking after dark, which if you think about it, is a clear sign that people were absolutely talking after dark. And yet, some convents turned this tension into a kind of quiet revolt. Women banded together, built their own power structures, educated each other, even ran small economies. In England, Abbesses Part 2, The Rebellious Brides of Christ, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. That means you're officially committed to this slow descent into medieval monastic absurdity. If you've drifted off and are just half listening from dreamland, that's fine too. The nuns of the 14th century would approve of your contemplative stillness, so where were we? Ah yes, women locked behind walls, told to be silent, obedient, and pure, which, historically speaking, are the three easiest rules for humanity to immediately break: power, piety, and property. Let's start with something a little surprising. Some nuns were incredibly powerful, not in a swords and crowns way, no one storming castles in a habit, but in the way that quietly terrifies kings and bishops. See, medieval convents weren't just prayer factories. They owned land, collected rents, hired workers, managed vineyards and mills, and at the top of all that was the abbess, the spiritual CEO. A good abbess could control hundreds of people, negotiate taxes, and sometimes even defy the local lord, which was, of course, both impressive and deeply irritating to men who thought women shouldn't even read, let alone manage property portfolios. There's a famous case from 13th century France where an abbess was accused of acting as though she were a bishop, which basically meant she was good at her job. Naturally, they tried to replace her with a man. Naturally, she refused to leave. And, after several years of angry letters from Rome, she was still there. Sometimes holiness was less about turning the other cheek and more about digging your heels into the cloister floor. The convent as family business now. For noble families, convents often became a sort of dynastic insurance plan. Let's say you have 5 daughters, and you're only rich enough to marry off 2. You send the rest to the same convent, and suddenly you've got a nice little family empire inside the church. Abbesses were often daughters of nobility. If you had 3 sisters in the same convent, one would likely end up in charge, and the others would make sure the convent's wealth and influence stayed in the family. Some convents were basically aristocratic clubs: velvet habits, private feasts, servants, and the occasional little pet dog. A far cry from the barefoot, self-denying image of saintly women living off crusts of bread. And when you have a bunch of high-born ladies with time, privacy, and political ambition, you get letters. Lots of them. Letters to kings, to cardinals, even to the Pope. Some full of flattery, some full of threats, some requesting funds to repair the chapel roof, which everyone knew was code for, "We'd like more imported wine. Thank you." The church often turned a blind eye because, honestly, who wants to start a fight with an abbess who controls half your local tithes? The great escapes, of course. Not every nun accepted her fate with such poise. Some just left. Escaping a convent was no easy feat. The gates were locked, the walls were high, and guards often patrolled the grounds. But desperation is a powerful motivator. Take the case of Sister Agnes, from 15th century England. She'd been sent to a convent against her will at age 14. By 20, she'd had enough. So she forged a letter from the bishop. Yes, forged, which was quite bold for someone who wasn't even allowed to own ink, and presented it to the gatekeeper, claiming she was being transferred to another convent. He let her out. She promptly ran away with a man she'd met during his charitable visits. The scandal was enormous. The bishop launched an inquiry. Agnes was eventually found living quietly on a small farm, apparently quite happy and extremely uninterested in returning. The records say she was re-admonished and forgiven, which probably means the church realized she was not coming back and decided to call it grace. Let's drift over to France, and a nun with a sword. Then there's Jeanne de la Motte, a 14th century French noblewoman turned nun who managed to outdo almost everyone in terms of chaos. Jeanne was clever, charming, and absolutely not interested in living by convent rules. She gambled, hosted feasts, and had a very close friendship with a visiting knight. Close enough that her fellow sisters began referring to her as the Lady of Misrule. When church officials tried to investigate, she locked herself in her room, armed with, somehow, a sword, and refused to come out. The bishop called for reinforcements. Jeanne eventually surrendered, but only after negotiating terms. She was exiled to another convent, where, according to later notes, she maintained a lively correspondence with gentlemen of noble rank, which is medieval historian code for she kept doing exactly what she wanted. Love, letters, and Latin puns. By the 12th and 13th centuries, convents were actually known as hubs of literacy. Many women there were highly educated, fluent in Latin, writing poetry, copying manuscripts, and when educated people are lonely, they tend to write. One of the most famous correspondences from the Middle Ages comes from Heloise and Abelard, though Heloise wasn't a nun yet when their scandal began. Still, her later years in the convent give us a rare look into what that life felt like. Her letters are full of love, pain, and quiet rebellion. She writes, "I should have been more than a mistress, yet less than a wife." It's haunting and very human. Even centuries later, you can still feel the tension between her devotion and the lingering ghost of desire. Other nuns followed her example, writing hymns and prayers that read suspiciously like love poetry. They'd simply swap lover for lord and hope the bishop didn't notice. The forbidden friendships while church. Documents tend to focus on heterosexual scandals. The nuns sneaking off with priests in local nights. There's also evidence of deep, sometimes romantic bonds between women inside convents. Of course, the records describe them in careful terms like particular friendships, which is medieval clerical speak for, we know something's going on, but we're too uncomfortable to describe it. Some of these relationships were probably emotional rather than physical, a kind of closeness born from isolation. But others, well, some of those confessions got oddly specific. One 15th century abbess in Germany was investigated because several nuns were reportedly sharing beds and affection in ways unbecoming. The church's response? Mandatory separation, and a lot of additional fasting, because apparently nothing cures love like hunger. Still, these friendships were often the only source of warmth in lives defined by obedience and confinement. They wrote each other letters filled with tenderness, sometimes sealed with personal tokens, ribbons, hair, little drawings. They may not have been free, but they made something resembling love anyway. The church gets nervous. By the late Middle Ages, church authorities had started to realize that locking up hundreds of young, frustrated women might not be the recipe for saintly behavior. So the rules got harsher. Walls were raised higher. Confession had to be done in public spaces. Windows were barred, and new nuns were explicitly warned against familiarity with priests or fellow sisters. Of course, none of that really stopped anything. It just made it harder to Part 3. Angels with ink-stained fingers, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted a medieval prayer vigil. If you've nodded off, that's fine too. I'll keep talking softly. You can drift in and out like a monk halfway through matins. Tonight, the nuns have changed a little. It's the 15th and 16th centuries now. Europe is shifting. Art, music, and humanism are all blooming outside the convent walls. But inside, women are still being cloistered, still writing letters they aren't supposed to send, and still finding creative ways to exist in silence, and some of them are about to get very creative indeed. The singing. Sisters, let's start in Italy because, of course we are, where everything from opera to scandal seems to have been invented. In Ferrara, around 1570, there was a convent known as San Vito. It was home to a group of nuns who sang so beautifully that local nobles came just to listen. They performed behind a grill, unseen, voices floating out like ghostly music. People called it the music of angels. The irony was that those angels were mostly bored aristocrats who'd been forced into the veil and discovered that singing was the only pleasure left available. They trained rigorously, composed original pieces, and soon the convent was famous across Italy. Patrons sent donations, not for the souls of the departed, but for tickets, essentially. Some bishops tried to shut it down. They claimed the music was too sensual, which probably meant it was just good. And yet, the convent choirs kept growing. All over Italy, cloistered women became the unseen heart of the Renaissance soundscape. No one could see their faces, but their voices, strong, emotional, haunting, filled the chapels and salons of Europe. You could almost say it was their secret rebellion. They couldn't speak freely, but they could sing. The nun who painted saints with attitude. Now let's move a little south, to Florence, and meet Sister Plautilla Nelli, one of the first recognized female painters of the Renaissance. Nelli ran a convent workshop where she and her sisters painted religious scenes. The church naturally loved the output, but what they didn't notice, or maybe politely ignored, was how human Nelli's figures were. Her saints looked tired. Her Madonnas looked like women who hadn't slept in days. Even her Christs had faint traces of irritation, as if they were quietly thinking, "Another crucifixion commission, really?" She signed her works modestly. Pray for the painter, Sister Plautilla, which was both pious and slightly passive-aggressive. Over time, her paintings were sold to wealthy patrons, bringing income to her convent, and a bit of fame to the woman who technically wasn't supposed to have either. Nelli's art was gentle defiance. Every brushstroke said, "We're here. We're not invisible. We're doing something that matters." Letters, love, and the Spanish cloisters. Meanwhile, across the sea in Spain, convents were going through their own identity crisis. The Reformation had shaken Europe, and suddenly everyone was suspicious of religious orders. Were they pure? Were they corrupt? Were they hiding something? Well, yes to all three. Some Spanish convents became deeply reformed, with strict silence and fasting. Others, didn't. In one convent in Toledo, records mention excessive conversation, the wearing of jewels, and an incident involving a young gentleman discovered near the laundry. Ah, yes, the laundry, eternal accomplice of forbidden romance. There's also the case of Sor Juana de la Cruz, who wasn't scandalous so much as brilliant. She was a poet, philosopher, and self-taught scholar who joined a convent mainly because it was the only place a woman could own a library. From her cell, she wrote essays defending women's right to education, which, predictably, horrified her male superiors. They tried to silence her. She responded with an essay so sharp it could have cut through marble. Eventually, they forced her to stop writing, but by then her words were already circulating through Spain, whispered and copied by admirers. Sor Juana's rebellion wasn't about love or sin, it was about intellect. But it came from the same root, the simple human desire to be more than what the rules allowed, the possessed nuns of Laudun. And now, we come to France, which means things are about to get weird. It's the 1630s, and in the little town of Laudun, a convent of Ursuline nuns suddenly starts acting, strangely screaming, speaking in tongues, levitating, or at least trying to. Doctors were called, then priests, then exorcists. The nuns claimed they were possessed by demons, sent by a local priest named Urbain Grandier, whom, incidentally, some of them had found rather attractive before the alleged possession began. The entire affair spiraled into a witch hunt, full of political intrigue, confessions under torture, and performances of mass exorcisms that drew huge crowds. Grandier was executed. The nuns were declared purified, and the church quietly filed the whole thing under, "Let's never talk about this again." Modern historians suspect hysteria, manipulation, or just psychological trauma from isolation, but in a strange way the event shows how desperate these women were to be noticed. No one cared when they were silent, but the moment they screamed, everyone listened. The art of being invisible. Across Europe, convents continued to function as both prisons and sanctuaries. For some women, it was the only place they could avoid marriage. For others, it was an unwanted exile, and for a rare few, it was a loophole. A way to live, think, and even create in a world that otherwise gave them nothing. If you were clever, you could make the system work for you. Pretend to be pious, keep your head down, write your poetry as prayers, sing your passions as hymns. The church could never quite control what happened inside a woman's mind. And in that small, quiet rebellion, the medieval nun became one of the most paradoxical figures in history, visible but hidden, silent but heard. Imprisoned, yet sometimes more free than the wives outside the walls. The nun who said no to the Pope, speaking of loopholes, meet Sister Caterina Vigri, better known later as Saint Catherine of Bologna. She was an Italian noblewoman who joined a convent in the early 1400s, and she had a talent for painting, music, and diplomacy. She was appointed abbess, which meant she had to take orders from local bishops and, occasionally, from the Pope himself. One day, a papal envoy showed up demanding that her convent donate funds to a new project in Rome. Catherine refused, politely but firmly. When the envoy tried to pressure her, she told him, "We have given our dowries to God, not to bankers." A rare mic-drop moment in an age before microphones. She held her ground, and eventually the Pope backed down. After her death, she was canonized. Proof that sometimes, even holy stubbornness can pay off. The smells, sounds, and silences of the cloister. It's easy to imagine convent life as peaceful. But the truth was more sensory. The smell of tallow candles and unwashed linen. The echo of bare feet on stone floors. The creak of wooden doors, and the endless rhythmic murmur of prayer. In winter, the rooms were freezing. In summer, stifling. Meals were simple. Bread, cheese, beans, sometimes fish. Always gratitude. Yet amid that monotony, small luxuries existed. A sister might keep a pressed flower hidden in her prayer book. Another might carve a tiny heart into her pew. Someone might sneak an extra spoonful of honey and confess it later as culinary pride. Those tiny rebellions, those private flickers of humanity, were the heartbeat of the cloister. Let's drift to the edge of the Age of Reason by the 1700s. The world outside was changing faster than the convent walls could keep up. Empires were expanding. Philosophy was challenging faith, and revolutions were brewing. Quite literally, in the coffee houses of Paris. Convents were starting to look old-fashioned. Some were dissolved. Others turned into schools, hospitals, or quiet ruins swallowed by ivy. But even as the institutions faded, their legacy lingered, not in miracles or relics, but in the quiet resistance of the women who lived there. Artists, poets, mystics, lovers, rebels, dreamers. They were supposed to vanish into silence. Instead, they left echoes. The last vows. When the walls finally crumbled, it begins, as endings often do, with silence. Not the sacred silence of prayer, but the heavy quiet of abandonment. Convents that had stood for centuries were suddenly emptying. Young women stopped entering. Dowries were no longer paid. The great families of Europe had new ambitions. Trade, politics, salons, revolutions, and religion? Well, it was beginning to look old-fashioned. The convent in the shadow of the guillotine, Paris, 1792. The revolution is in full swing, and the world outside the convent gates is chaos. Mobs, gunfire, pamphlets, and poetry all at once. Inside the walls of Carmel de Compiègne, 16 nuns gather in their chapel. They know what's coming. The revolutionary government has outlawed monastic vows, calling them a crime against liberty. Their convent will be closed, their property seized, their habits burned, but the sisters refuse to renounce their vows. They pray. They sing softly, and one by one they are led to the guillotine. Eyewitnesses say they climbed the scaffold singing Salve Regina, their voices fading as the blade fell. Their execution shocked even the revolutionaries. Some began to whisper that these women had died not as symbols of oppression, but as quiet martyrs of conscience. After the terror ended, their story spread through Europe, a final, haunting echo of an era that was vanishing. The Age of Reason meets the Age of Faith. While France was tearing down its cloisters elsewhere in Europe, the Enlightenment was politely dismantling them with philosophy instead of guillotines. Thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot mocked the convent system mercilessly. In his Nun's Confession, Diderot told the story of a young woman forced into vows she didn't want. A tragic figure trapped in a gilded cage. It wasn't just fiction, it was a mirror. For centuries, the convent had been both sanctuary and prison, depending on who you asked. Now, society began to see only the prison. But it wasn't quite that simple. For every tragic novice forced to take vows, there were women who still found purpose inside the cloister. Teaching, healing, or writing. Some even became early feminists, though they would never have used the word. They believed that faith could still belong to women, just not under the control of men. The escaped nun and the scandal of the century. Every era has its celebrity scandal. And in the 18th century, one of the most famous came from behind convent walls. Her name was Suzanne Simonin, better known to readers as the Nun, the heroine of Diderot's novel. But there were real Suzannes. One such case was Sister Marguerite Delamare, who tried to annul her vows and leave her convent. Her family and the church fought bitterly over it, dragging the case through courts and pamphlets. The public devoured every word. It had everything: forbidden vows, hidden letters, powerful men, and a woman's desperate plea to control her own life. The case became symbolic. It wasn't just about one nun. It was about whether women had the right to say no. By the late 1700s, pamphlets and plays about nuns were everywhere. They were tragic, romantic, erotic, heroic, depending on who was writing. And for the first time, society began to see the convent not as a mystery, but as a metaphor for repression itself. The Secret Lovers of Lisbon. Let's step out of the courtroom for a moment, and into something far more intimate. In 18th century Portugal, a collection of letters was discovered, written by an anonymous nun to her vanished lover. They were passionate, eloquent, and devastating. "I love you as one condemned loves their executioner," she wrote. "I am your sin and your salvation." The letters were published in Paris under the title Letters of a Portuguese Nun, and they became a sensation. Historians still debate whether they were genuine or a literary invention, but that hardly matters. They captured something real: the emotional claustrophobia of a woman trapped between faith and desire. Whether that nun ever truly existed or not, her words became immortal, and in them, the voice of centuries of silenced women seemed to whisper all at once. The ghost convents by the early 1800s. Most of Europe's convents had been emptied or repurposed. Some became hospitals. Some prisons, some simply decayed. Stone walls cracked, vines curling through cloisters once swept by silent feet. Travelers of the Romantic era loved these ruins. They called them melancholy relics. Poets sketched them. Painters turned them into landscapes of longing. The world had moved on, and yet Those quiet courtyards still felt inhabited by memory. The nuns were gone, but their presence lingered in the air. A faint scent of candle wax, ink, and lavender. The nuns who refused to die. Not all of them disappeared, though. In places like Ireland and Italy, small communities persisted, adapting to modernity with surprising grace. They opened schools, ran hospitals, and became some of the first organized networks of women's education in Europe. They traded Latin for ledgers, choir books for textbooks. They taught girls to read, to count, to think. Ironically, the same walls that had once imprisoned women became the foundations of their future power. One 19th-century sister in Ireland wrote, "We took vows to serve God, but found ourselves serving the daughters of the poor. Perhaps that is closer to his will than we knew." The forbidden nun becomes a myth by the time the 19th century was in full bloom. The forbidden nun had become a romantic archetype. Painters showed her gazing out of barred windows, eyes full of yearning. Writers cast her as the eternal symbol of lost innocence, of temptation, of faith undone by love. It was part fantasy, part truth, but it stuck. The real women, the ones who had lived it, became legends rewritten by men who never set foot in a cloister. Their complexities were smoothed away, replaced by poetry and scandal. But their real legacy was subtler, stronger. They had survived centuries of silence and turned it into something powerful. Music, art, words, defiance. The final vespers, so here we are. The candle has burned low, and the last of the cloister bells has gone quiet. The convent, once a fortress of obedience, has become a ghost, but not a sad one. More like an old house that still hums with memory. Walk through it now in your mind. The echo of sandals on stone, the murmur of prayers that once rose like smoke, the faint glimmer of gold leaf on a manuscript page. Each whisper, each note, each forbidden letter, all part of a long, secret conversation between women who refused to vanish completely. They lived unseen, but they left traces. And those traces, words, songs, brushstrokes, stories, are still here. You're hearing one right now. Epilogue, the eternal cloister. If you listen closely, maybe you can still hear them. The voices of centuries past, not praying now, but humming softly, almost like a lullaby. Because that's what this has been all along. A bedtime story for ghosts. The secret lives of medieval nuns. Forbidden, faithful, flawed, and profoundly human. Not saints, not sinners, just women, trapped and transcendent, singing quietly in the dark.